So, hello everyone, welcome back to Hit Points in History 2024. Our next presenter for this hour is going to be Roselyn A. Campbell. She is going to be presenting to us on The Queen and the NPC, Player Perceptions of Gender in Assassin's Creed. And just a bit of background on Dr. Roselyn A. Campbell is a bioarchaeologist and Egyptologist. She received her PhD in archaeology from the Costin Institute of Archaeology at UCLA. Dr. Campbell conducted archaeological fieldwork across many sites in Egypt, including the Valley of Kings, Deir al-Bahari, and Tel Edfu, as well as Jordan, Peru, Ethiopia, Spain, and the Western United States. Her research focuses on anthropological studies of state-sanctioned violence in the past through the analysis of human remains, as well as evidence for cancer in antiquity. She is currently a visiting professor of biological anthropology at the University of California, Riverside, and the assistant director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. Her favorite video games are Assassin's Creed Black Flag and God of War. So without any further ado, Roselyn Campbell, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to pull up my notes here. So is everybody still seeing my slides? Because I can't see you at all. So please let me know if that's not.
Yes, we still see your slides.
All right, great. All right, thank you all so much for attending. Huge shout out to the organizers for all of your work putting this together. As you heard from my bio, this is something very different than what I usually work on. This is a new study that I've been working on, and so I'm going to share with you some of the early stages looking at gender and specifically women and female gender and how that's presented and perceived by players in the Assassin's Creed games. So we'll start kind of by looking at the context of gender depictions and especially depictions of women in video games overall. And let's see here. There we go. All right. Historically, women in video games have been famously hypersexualized, frequently appearing with highly exaggerated proportions. Lara Croft is a famous example, as is Ivy here from Soul Calibur 6, and improbably small clothing and armor. Now, for being fair, male characters are not necessarily highly armored either, even if they are covered with a few more centimeters or meters of clothing. The trend of depicting hypersexualized women has been attributed to a video game market that we're told is heavily dominated by young heterosexual male players. So the narrative is that these games are sort of designed to draw them in via their hormones, if you will. Now, it may be the case that male players used to heavily dominate the video game world, and they certainly do still dominate the development side of things. A survey in early 2023 suggested that at least 49% of gamers identify as female. Female-led games like Horizon Zero Dawn and its recent sequel have been widely praised and immensely popular, with the main female protagonist often cited as one of the best video game protagonists ever made. In the past few years, increasing attention has been paid in academic circles to video games, hence why we're all here, and particularly games that portray historical or archaeological topics. Several notable publications have also addressed portrayals of women specifically in video games, including archaeological and historical video games. And these contributions there's a huge range. Some of them look at the accuracy of depictions of women. Others look at how many women are in the games, when they appear versus the men, etc. But I'm going to take a slightly different tack today. My goal is instead to shift the focus a little bit and look instead at how players might perceive some of these portrayals and how these portrayals might play into preconceived biases, misconceptions, and overall perceptions of the ancient world. So with this in mind, and building on this literature as well as the work of many individuals who are here, let's shift our attention to the Assassin's Creed games. Now, I do realize that a lot of you have probably played these games and are familiar with them, but just for the sake of any who haven't, I'm going to start with a really broad overview. The Assassin's Creed franchise, created by Montreal-based company Ubisoft, is enormously popular. As of late last year, Assassin's Creed games had sold some 200 million copies, with estimates suggesting at least 155 million individual players. There are 13 games that fall into the main storyline, as well as multiple spin-offs, side games. There's a series of novels. There was a movie in 2016 and supposedly a TV show in development. The games are primarily based in action and stealth, with players exploring massive open worlds and solving puzzles, as well as engaging in combat and, of course, the stealth assassinations that the game is famous for. Each game is set in a different time period, a different historical time period, and has a different protagonist, although there are a few games that share a protagonist or have an overlapping characters. The games are set against the backdrop of an ancient conflict between the Templars, who believe in removing free will as a path to universal peace, and the assassins who support free will for all and who are sort of the broad protagonists. The games feature both modern and ancient components. In the modern era, a company named Abstergo has found a way for individuals to enter a machine called the Animus, and connects to their DNA, and so people are able to relive the experiences of their ancestors through that shared DNA, which is how, as a player, you experience various historical time periods. Now, I want to note that that is a vastly simplified and condensed version of hundreds and hundreds of hours of story and side quests and mystical plots over all of these games, but we're keeping it short for the purpose of this presentation. The primary point of interest for our purposes is that players are able to inhabit richly textured open worlds that are set in real historical times and places. Players are given an avatar to play through the memories of someone in the past and encounter all sorts of individuals and NPCs, or non-player characters, that populate the game worlds. Some of these NPCs are just kind of background characters that wander around in the world, so it's not empty. Maybe they provide side quests or support the main story, while others are depictions of real people who lived in the past. So in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, for example, players explore London during the late 1860s, meeting and performing tasks for such characters as Charles Darwin, Alexander Graham Bell, Karl Marx, and Charles Dickens, among others. And in Black Flag, you get to interact with various famous pirates like Edward Teach, Mary Read, Stede Bonnet, and Anne Bonny. For the purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing on 4 games that are set in the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, mainly because that's where I work. That's where I do my academic work. So I'll talk about the original Assassin's Creed Origins, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and Assassin's Creed Mirage. So we'll start with the very first Assassin's Creed game. It's called Assassin's Creed. It was released in 2017. The modern-day protagonist, Desmond Miles, enters the Animus to relive the memories of his ancestor Altair ibn Lahad in Jerusalem, Damascus, and the surrounding areas during the Third Crusade. The game got pretty positive reviews overall when it was released, and at the time, the visuals and elaborate open world were particularly noteworthy. It has been remastered a bit. It might look a little simple to us, but at the time, the open world and the detailed realistic depictions were groundbreaking. Altair begins the game by botching a mission by being extremely arrogant, and spends the rest of the game trying to atone for his crime and regain his status among the assassins. So in all of the games, you'll play as an assassin in general. The player encounters very few women as gameplay progresses. There are a few women in the environment as NPCs, although less than the men, and in some of the cutscenes, we are treated to temple dancers who are quite literally faceless. Now, this is not to say that there are no female characters at all, and indeed, later in the game, our hero encounters a clever Templar named Maria Thorpe, who reveals crucial information about the leader of the Templars and plays a significant role in the overarching story of the assassins and their lineage. And I won't say more for spoilers if someone hasn't played this whole game yet. Overall, however, women are far less present in the game than men and contribute pretty little to the overall plot. Even as you wander around the world, you don't really encounter a lot of female NPCs. Origins was released in 2017, so about 10 years later, and it was set at the end of the Ptolemaic period in Egypt, so between 49 and 44 BCE. The game follows Bayek and occasionally his wife Aya as they seek revenge for the death of their young son. Now, the vast majority of the game is played as Bayek, although there are a handful of small and very limited quests that you can play as Aya. But these quests with Aya don't allow you as a player to use the skills or weapons that you've gained while playing as Bayek, and you really have no choice. You can only play those missions, either the broader mission as Bayek and then these limited ones as Aya, and they occur pretty late in the game, actually. However, that being said, Aya is a strong, intelligent, and independent character, and it's she actually who's credited with the creation of the Hidden Ones, who will later become the Assassins. Female NPCs are noticeably more present in Origins, populating the side quests and going about their business in the world. And at least they have fully realized faces. Overall, their clothing and activities tend toward the practical and realistic, although not necessarily authentic, rather than the overly sexualized, although in general, the women seem to wear a little bit less clothing than the men. You can see an example of this particular trend in this image here of our heroes who are dressed for an important occasion, where Bayek is wearing multiple layers of clothing, but Aya sports an exposed midriff and apparently no trousers underneath her very elaborately draped loincloth. On the other hand, we'll have to be fair here, on at least one mission, Bayek wears nothing but a towel, so we can at least appreciate that both men and women are reduced to their bodies and their perceived attractiveness at some level in this game. As is often the case in these games, the player interacts with important figures from real life, including Julius Caesar, and most relevant to our discussion, Cleopatra VII. One of the most controversial aspects of Origins has been the portrayal of Cleopatra, at least among academic circles. Cleopatra features prominently in the game as Bayek and Aya work with and for her at various points throughout the story. On the one hand, Cleopatra is depicted as cunning and powerful, but she's also depicted as decadent and cruel. At one lavish party, Cleopatra declares that she will sleep with anyone, so long as they agree to be executed in the morning. Now, I do want to point out that in the game, everyone sort of laughs a bit uncomfortably, and it's implied that this offer is more of a joke and a demonstration of decadence rather than a real situation, but we'll return to this point later. Assassin's Creed Odyssey, released in 2018, is set earlier in time than Origins by a few hundred years, and takes place across the many islands of Greece. For the first time, players were allowed to choose their protagonist for the entire game, playing either as Cassandra or as her brother, Alexios. Regardless of which protagonist is chosen, the other sibling features as an antagonist of the story. Now, Cassandra is widely considered the better protagonist for multiple reasons, and she was designated as the canon character by Ubisoft, although you'll notice that it's still Alexios that appears on just about all of the marketing material. In general, the women that players encounter in Odyssey appear to be fairly realistic, and like we saw in Origins, they are sexualized to a far less degree than in previous and non-Assassin's Creed games. And at least in the case of Cassandra, her armor is just as practical as that of Alexios. We're not seeing some of the rather ridiculous, highly sculpted bra or bikini armor that you often see in games with armored female protagonists, where they basically just have a metal bra instead of a full suit of armor. One of the most talked about changes that came about with the introduction of a female protagonist was the opportunity to romance both males and females equally. Now, on the one hand, the outcome doesn't change whether it's Cassandra or Alexios that's seducing any particular character, regardless of gender. but at least players aren't forced into binary heterosexual relationships if they do want to romance a side character. And I'll note here that none of these relationships have very much of an effect on the overall story. I do, however, want to mention briefly a side quest in one of the DLCs that's created a lot of controversy. So at one point, in order to complete a mission, the protagonist has to get married and have a child with a partner of the opposite sex. Now, this occurs whether you play as Cassandra or as Alexios, but a lot of people got upset because the only way to complete the quest was to settle into this heterosexual relationship and reproduce, have a child. So Ubisoft did apologize and modified the mission somewhat so that you can either treat it as sort of a romantic relationship or it can play out more like a necessity to keep the bloodline going, where you basically just have to reproduce to keep the bloodline continuous. But it is a side plot that comes up a lot, and a lot of people really weren't satisfied even with the modified version, which I think is fair, right? This is still a pretty binary type of situation. The newest installation in the Assassin's Creed franchise is Mirage. It was just released in October. This is set in 9th century Baghdad, and the game follows Basim as he transitions from a street thief to a member of the Hidden Ones who will later become the Assassins. Players explore Baghdad as well as a few smaller towns and fortresses around the area. And this game is interesting in that Basim was actually introduced as a side character in Valhalla, but in Mirage, he gets his own game. This game is a little bit smaller in terms of play hours and map than some of the really massive previous games. And Mirage focuses a little bit more on stealth and puzzles rather than the open combat that characterizes, for example, Valhalla and even Odyssey to some degree. Within just a couple minutes of gameplay, it's already apparent that not only are there a lot more female characters in Mirage than in many of the previous games, but that these characters play integral roles in the main storyline. Basim's best friend and confidant is a young woman named Nahal, who has apparently known Basim since childhood. Players are also introduced to Roshan, who is a prominent and highly respected assassin who contributes to Basim's training, and Rebecca, a young woman who, we're told, has abandoned a dissatisfying life of privilege to become the blacksmith for an enclave of assassins outside Baghdad. Now, there's no option to play through this game as a female protagonist, so it's breaking with the tradition of Valhalla and Odyssey before it, but this is presumably because, unlike other games where you're introduced to a new character for the protagonist, this game focuses on a character that players have already met and interacted with in the previous game. So if you've played through Valhalla, you've already met Basim and gone on missions and things like that with Basim as a male. So with these games in mind, my study aims to look at how players themselves view the accuracy and authenticity of these games in terms of gender. Now, of course, these games are understood to be fictionalized, but they do market themselves as being based in extensive historical and archaeological research. So I approached this topic with three main questions. First of all, in a game that depicts real-time periods and people, how are gender relations portrayed in the game? Secondly, how are gender relations in these games understood and perceived by players? And relatedly, how do these depictions affect players' perceptions of gender in the past in real societies? In order to understand how players perceive these games, I took a multi-pronged approach. So first, I played the games, obviously. Recording screenshots and documenting interactions with women throughout the game, focusing especially on traits like clothing, social roles, and occupation, and broadly speaking, the prevalence of men versus women. I also consulted with friends and colleagues who had played these games, sometimes many more hours than I had, and had other insights and their own opinions. I then turned to social media and chat forums to see what players were actually talking about. Using the search terms shown here, as well as others, I spent a lot of time on chat sites like Reddit and Discord to see what discussions of gender and accuracy might actually look like with regard to these games. And as an aside, I just cannot recommend this as a research strategy unless you're prepared for the onslaught of sexism and terrible behavior that the anonymity of the internet encourages. So you've been warned. The third step in this study was the creation and dissemination of an anonymous online survey about these games, which you can see the beginning of here. You can also access it via this QR code. So I'll show the QR code again later. This survey asks players a variety of questions about gender depictions, accuracy, and player preferences regarding the protagonist. Now, since most conversations on social media focus on the playable characters, the survey was also a chance to explore how or if players had any thoughts on the gender and depictions of the NPCs broadly. So let's take a look at some of the findings in the next few slides, both within the survey and from online in the chat forums. I do want to note that because I want to preserve the voices of individual players, I'll be showing snippets of real conversations on some of the chat forums for the rest of this presentation. So because I'm using screenshots of real conversations and responses to the survey, there's going to be typos and colloquialisms. I took out some of the more profane responses, but there are going to be, these are just natural responses, right? So there's going to be various typos and things like that. So far, I've received a little more than 350 responses to the survey. Please add to that number. I want as many people as I can. Nearly 200 of the players identify as male, so about 195. You can see that orange bar there. And slightly fewer, 135, represented by the green bar, identify as female. Only 26 individuals so far have identified themselves as non-binary. You can see here with the red bar. And then there's also an option for other or prefer not to say. Interestingly, players were very divided when it came to the gender of the protagonists that they preferred to play. Almost a third of the survey respondents, here shown by the red bar, said that their preference would depend on the game and the setting. Only slightly fewer, green bar here, said that they would prefer to play as female, followed by individuals who had no preference at all, which is the yellow bar, or who preferred to play as male, which is the orange bar. But the largest group of respondents were more concerned about the setting or the individual game than playing as a character who matched their own gender identity. Now, I do want to note here that I've categorized gender as mostly binary just because that's how the games treat gender, right? The games have a pretty simplistic view of gender overall, and so respondents were asked to consider the options that have been available to them in the games. Even for characters that were introduced as one gender or another, one gender and another, let me just try that sentence again. Even for characters that were introduced as one gender in another game, like Basim in Mirage, there were a few players that did indicate they still wanted a female version, although this opinion seems to be very much in the minority. There was just a couple people that mentioned this. Many players expressed that while they might prefer to play as their own gender, they didn't necessarily have a strong preference, and this was particularly true among players on the chat forums who indicated that they identified as male and might usually play as male, but would also choose to switch things up and play as a female now and then. Now, when asked why players might have a gender preference for the protagonist, those who responded, so this was an open-ended question, usually said that they identified more with a protagonist that matched their own gender identity, which is kind of interesting since on the previous slide, most people said it would depend on the game, but when given the choice, a lot of people did say that they would prefer to match their own gender identity if possible. One of the first things I wanted to get at with the survey was how players perceive the accuracy of these games with regard to gender. A very small percentage of respondents indicated that they didn't care about the accuracy of these games, which is the pink bar you can see here. The light blue represents players who responded that they had no idea how accurate the game was. And if we speculate a little bit, I wonder if these players selecting that they had no idea rather than that they didn't care suggests that even if players aren't researching the accuracy or, having conversations about it, it might be something they've still thought about, right? It's not that they don't care so much, it's that they have no idea. Speculation, but I think it's an interesting nuance. Most respondents suggested that the depictions of gender and gender relationships in the game were at least somewhat accurate. But when asked specifically about gender balance of the world, the answer shifted a bit. Slightly over half of the respondents felt that there were more male than female NPCs, especially in active roles. Only about 20% indicated that they felt both men and women were equally represented, and roughly the same number said that they really didn't think about the gender balance when they were playing the game. Now, again, I want to remind everybody that this is binary because the game has categorized this as binary, right? This is not obviously a reflection of gender and sexuality in the real world. Many players and survey respondents also noted that the women of Assassin's Creed often seem more sexualized than the men in terms of clothing and activities, but maybe with less stark differences between the sexes than we see in other games. So you can see here some of the free responses to the survey, where players responded that women seemed to be more attractive than men overall, that some of the men weren't very attractive, but the women were pretty much always considered attractive. Obviously subjective, but still interesting. That female NPCs seemed to often have unnecessary amounts of cleavage, that they were shown in sexualized professions like dancers or sex workers, while men were more frequently shown in positions of power and influence, like mercenaries or leaders, priests, things like that. At least one respondent did point out that Bayek, the male protagonist from Origins, is also, quote, a thirst trap, end quote. So this approach isn't entirely unique to women in these games, but there is broad agreement overall that women are at least slightly more sexualized than men, even when it comes to people just wandering around in the game world. Historical accuracy overall does come up a little bit more than I expected. To be honest, I did kind of wonder if most players ignored this aspect of the game, leaving those of us who spend our lives studying these periods to obsess over the various smaller and larger inaccuracies. One player jokingly commented, quote, "I look back on Assassin's Creed 2 and fondly remember the historically accurate recreation of when the Pope got into a fistfight for control of an ancient alien vault buried under the Sistine Chapel," end quote. But joking aside, the topic of accuracy does actually appear fairly regularly in these conversations. There is general agreement that these games are not, of course, perfectly accurate representations of people, events, and life in the past. But there is also an acknowledgement that while significant fictionalization has taken place, the games are still very much grounded in real places and events, to a much greater degree than many other games. One of the most common points of conversation regarding women, gender, and sexuality in these games is about Cleopatra. Now, the various accuracies and inaccuracies of this depiction have been discussed at length elsewhere by other authors, so I won't spend a ton of time on those details here. But I do want to take a closer look at the kinds of conversations that players are having about this depiction. There are multiple variations of this conversation online. Opinion is largely divided, as you can see here, in response to this player's question about whether the depiction of Cleopatra was over-sexualized or somewhat more positive. Overall, it seems that the propaganda of the Romans retains its chokehold on how the public views Cleopatra, even today. The joke about sleeping with anyone calls to mind Roman interpretations of Cleopatra as promiscuous, despite the fact that based on current evidence, she was faithful to both Caesar and Mark Antony, her only crime appearing that she had the audacity to choose another man after Caesar died. She is also depicted as ruthless and out to save her own throne and her own skin in the game, which is a fairly negative interpretation of a woman who managed to retain control of Egypt for quite some time, and echoes a trend we often see where women in positions of power are viewed and described as selfish and grasping, where a man in the same position is called ambitious and powerful. One of the key points about accuracy that I really didn't anticipate revolved around gender norms and sexism in past cultures. And this particularly cropped up with regard to Odyssey, where for the first time players could play as a female for the entire game. Many players argued that regardless of the protagonist's gender, the game should construct a realistic story around that individual, including cultural norms and attitudes towards sex and gender at that time. Now, on the one hand, this does reveal a pretty strong belief among the public that most societies in the past, and especially ancient Greece, were extremely patriarchal. This is mostly, though not completely true, and I think the more interesting takeaway here is that players are actually interested in more nuanced stories that reflect biases and shortcomings of the time in which these games are placed. One survey respondent noted that they thought that Odyssey and Origins both did a good job of portraying bisexuality in ancient Mediterranean cultures, but pointed out that gender and sexuality are not really acknowledged at all in the whole rest of the game. Whether the player chose a male or female protagonist makes no difference to the overarching story, to interactions with NPCs, access to various places or activities in society, or access to romantic encounters. As this respondent noted, the game could have been much more interesting if gender norms and biases were acknowledged in-game and affected how players interacted, thus allowing a much more interesting look at how women operate in patriarchal societies. There were multiple conversations where players commented that they appreciated representation of women, equal access to sexual partners and side quests or opportunities, but that it needed to be done thoughtfully and authentically. As many players pointed out, the choice of protagonist gender without acknowledging any impacts of sex or gender in the game world often feels kind of like an afterthought, paying lip service to diversity without actually committing to a game where the sole protagonist is female or non-binary, or to acknowledging how characters of different sexualities, genders, or biological sex might interact with the world. And again, I do want to highlight here that just because other societies might not have exactly the same characterization of sexuality or gender identity that we do, right? Like not necessarily having a category for non-binary doesn't mean that they didn't acknowledge gender beyond binaries and sexuality as well. We have lots of reference in ancient cultures to a whole range of gender identities and sexuality. So there was a lot of ancient cultures that acknowledged far more than just a gender binary. One of the most common themes in comments on Reddit in particular was the role of canon. Both male and female players indicated that even if they normally had a preference for the gender of their protagonist, their first choice would be to play whichever character Ubisoft designates as canon. And a common opinion was actually that the choice detracts from the story itself. And this is partly due to the way that Ubisoft tried to solve the side story of giving, the story side of giving players this choice, right? So in Odyssey, where you can choose between two siblings, the thing is that the other sibling still features in the story as an antagonist, but Cassandra was designated as canon after the game came out, and even appears in Valhalla, in the other game Valhalla, no matter who you play in Odyssey, right? So even if you played Alexios through all of Odyssey, you buy Valhalla, you start playing Valhalla, and it's Cassandra who shows up. So this left a lot of players feeling frustrated and feeling like they had wasted time or had to go back and replay the game as the canon character. Many players also commented that they didn't really care about the gender of the protagonist, but the choice itself just didn't make sense, right? Because if the animus, this machine that you're in, can identify your individual ancestors hundreds of years in the past based on their DNA, but couldn't tell if that individual is male or female, that also doesn't necessarily make sense in story terms. Of course, games and game developers do not exist in a vacuum, and the environment of development plays a role in decisions about the game. One argument that's frequently encountered in the world of gaming is that games with female protagonists just don't sell as well because the majority of gamers are male. Now, despite significant evidence to the contrary, this idea is remarkably tenacious. There have been multiple conversations and interviews which suggest that both Origins and Odyssey were supposed to have primarily or only female protagonists, but were changed to male-focused games due to pressure from executives trying to cater to this supposedly male-dominated market. And we do also have to consider that anyone involved in these games could be influenced by their own perceptions about gender and sexuality in the past. I mean, as I demonstrated, this idea of Cleopatra as promiscuous, ruthless, and self-serving is very much held by the population at large. This is a very common viewpoint overall. Another factor is the prevalence of toxicity, sexism, and harassment at Ubisoft, particularly during the development of Origins. As recently as last October, former Ubisoft executives, including the former chief creative officer, were detained as part of an ongoing harassment investigation. In 2020, the editorial vice president at Ubisoft resigned following allegations on social media that he was openly abusive to female employees, verbally as well as physically. And this culture of toxicity is definitely going to have an effect on these games, and especially the depictions of women and the women who are involved in these games, in making these games. So in conclusion, I want to talk a little bit about why this matters and what we can actually do with this information. Now, this is an ongoing study, so my plan is to continue the survey, incorporating some of the other games as well. So I would encourage any of you who've played these games, please fill out the survey, which you can access via this QR code. It's also on my poster, I think, in the exhibition hall. Now, from the standpoint of an educator and an academic, these games are really popular, and it's extremely likely that our students will at some point play or at least encounter these games. By understanding the exposure that they may have had to interpretations of the ancient world, we can better craft our instructional material to counter misconceptions and reference points of interest. Also, while I am in sympathy with the many valid critiques of the accuracy of these games, I think it's also important to remember that if we want to interest students in archaeology and the ancient world, we have to make things interesting. I came to gaming as an adult, making the probably questionable decision to start playing video games during graduate school, but I finished, so it's okay. In these Assassin's Creed games, specifically, I saw an iteration of what I also love about archaeology, the ability to bring aspects of the past to life, to immerse yourself in another place and time in 3 dimensions. If students think that accurate games would be incredibly boring, or that everything that we say about the past is guesswork anyway, maybe this is a signal for us to think more creatively about how we can make our work accessible to the public. In my mind, all of this represents an opportunity to have candid conversations with our students and the public about women, gender, and sexuality in the ancient world. Every culture has its own constructions of gender and sexuality, and analyzing why we view and present the past the way we do can help give our students the critical thinking skills that they will carry into the rest of their lives. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of the many people who have supported this survey so far, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the remaining time.
I see we have Julie approaching the mic here for a question. I want to invite any others to do so if they have questions of their own, or like we've done for other speakers, you can also put your questions in the chat. It's also where I've put a link that was from the QR code to go ahead and fill out the form yourself. So Julie, if you want to walk up and share your question, we're happy to hear it.
Thank you, Rose. That was really interesting. I have never played any of these games actually. I've tried to stay away from Ubisoft for reasons you may have mentioned. Although I did
Fair.
play Phoenix Rising, um, which has a similar question, right? It has the male and female protagonist who you can choose which gender you want to be, and the other one is there. Um, I was actually really caught by the idea of that side story, the mission where you have to get married and produce a child, because of course in many parts of ancient Greece that actually was pretty much how it worked. You could have whatever sexuality you wanted as long as you also got married and produced a child. So when it comes to something like that, where do you see our opportunities going in terms of accuracy versus something that's playable versus something that feels authentic?
That is a great question. So here's, I think, part of the eternal disconnect and problem, right? Is that, yes, you're exactly right. I think that there's this struggle between, so the last question of the survey asks the respondents to rank, are you most interested in, there's three options, but the two options that concern us right now are better representation, like more diverse representation, or an accurate story. And I purposely split those because I wanted to see what people say. And it's kind of divided. And so I think, me personally, I'm quite willing to suspend my disbelief. I love the Brendan Fraser mummy movies. I'm a sucker for a terrible recreation. Like I love this kind of stuff. But I think the caveat there is I think the way this could be done better is to have that storyline and then problematize it and have a part in there that says, in a lot of ancient cultures, not just Greece, but a lot of ancient cultures, it was really important to reproduce and have a kid. Nobody cares what you do the rest of the time. You do you. But we got to have, we got to continue the society and grow our population. And so you got to make a baby at some point. And to me, I think that's a better way to handle it for a couple reasons. One, it feels more authentic, I think, to the player because there's an acknowledgement that like we do understand why this is problematic and it doesn't feel like they're making something up. But two, I think, I'm also coming at this from the position of an educator, and a lot of my students just have not learned the critical thinking skills. And I think we see this in our world writ large, right? With this whole idea of fake news and who knows what to believe and all of this. And so I've really shifted my strategies in the last couple years as far as teaching to really try to get students to question everything. And I think they seem to appreciate that. And I think gamers would, I mean, gamers are people, right? Like I think we would appreciate that too. And as a gamer, I would rather see that, like, like the mummy presentation earlier, which was so interesting. I will play a game as a mummy. That's great. This is ridiculous recreation. Great. But I would then love to see something in there that says, hey, here's the history of orientalizing mummies. Isn't this interesting? And then you have kind of that dichotomy of you can suspend your disbelief, but here's more information as well, if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Megan?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, great. So just to reiterate, do you think male players would be more receptive to the idea of an actual female historical character who did go to war and did do more manly things? Like if we look at Herodotus's depiction of Queen Artemisia of Caria, and she's the only female naval commander in ancient Greek history and one of the few in all the world. And she's a pretty amazing character. And I feel like, is it possible, like from what you got, your feedback from terrible places like Reddit, but just like from the audience in general, do you think they would be more receptive if it was more couched in a sort of realism, like, hey, this is an actual naval commander, so you can't use the excuse of, well, this isn't realistic, or does it really just come down to, but that's, not my gender being depicted?
That's a really good question. And this was the only good thing, the only encouraging thing that came out of Reddit, which was just a hellish place, like truly. Um, I think they would be more receptive. There were a lot of people who responded and would self-identify. Like I think I left it in there, the guy who said I'm male and cis as hell or something like that. But he was like, I'll happily play a woman, just make a good story. And I saw a lot of different iterations of that, which I think was encouraging because I feel like so much of what we're told is that, well, video games are made for men, that men are mostly the ones that play. And it's not even players saying this, right? This is sort of the overarching media narrative, if you will. And what I saw was that people were far more interested in a nuanced, interesting story that felt authentic than they were in just playing someone who matched their gender. And I mean, like, I'm not critiquing it. I usually play as a woman because I identify as a woman and I like to play as a woman. There aren't that many in video games. So I'm not saying that is a critique, but I was encouraged by how many people were very open to the possibility of playing any gender identity as long as it's a good story, right? Which I think was better than I expected, especially because I didn't find that until I encountered a lot of the other crap, to be perfectly honest.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if I can get off the stage here.
Next up we have Ellen. Go ahead.
Hi there. I know from my perspective, I'd love less from a needing a male or female protagonist, but cool historical stories to explore just on its own merits would be amazing because you get to learn about these cool people who don't get as much press. No, I wanted to ask, especially because we were just talking about adding in elements of the actual history to the games where they're doing more liberties. Did you play around with in Odyssey where they had that museum mode where you were just walking through the historical locations? I'm curious on your views of that kind of thing, a living recreation as a means of achieving what we were talking about.
That's a great question. So you're talking about the discovery mode where you can like wander around without combat? Yeah. So I haven't done it as much in Odyssey. I have in Origins. I'm an Egyptologist by training, so I've done it in Origins. I think my opinion is probably unpopular because I was actually a little bit annoyed because, so for example, I study human remains, right? That's what I do. And they have a section on mummification. And obviously you can't necessarily encapsulate thousands of years of different mummification practices into one location.
A 100% accurate return and your max refund?
My problem with discovery mode, I think, was it did flatten all of that into here's what mummification always was in Egypt. And I think that's almost worse because then it's saying that it's educational while still presenting a very, very flat, one-sided view of something. And so I kind of hate that. I think the concept is great. I love the idea. But I think if you're going to present something and say, here is a more academic version, this is for you to learn, but you're still giving people not very good information, that's kind of worse than saying we're just doing this for entertainment. The other side is, and I think I saw a comment in the chat about this, you know, all of this stuff and these encyclopedia readings and things like that are optional. So you only really find them like the discovery mode or some of these entries if you're looking for them. And on the one hand, I feel like that's why people don't read them. And on the other hand, if you force people to read them, maybe the game is less fun. I'm not a game dev, so I can't decide exactly how you should do that. But I do think if you're going to say something is educational, then like do a good job.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sorry.
Oh, thank you.
Hello. Okay.
Wow.
So
There's so much happening in the chat.
yeah, I know. I was trying to follow and then I was like, no, I can't or I'll get lost.
I gave up.
So obviously I know I've been really looking forward to this presentation because I know you're doing such cool work. But it struck me though, one thing that I didn't even know I'd want to ask about until literally like 2 seconds before I got up. No, I'm kidding. Is, you know, have you thought about looking into kind of player reception, like perceptions of gender within just promotional material, not even like playing the full game, because it sparked something when we were talking about Valhalla. There was that controversy about the 2 trailers, right, for Valhalla. You had the original main trailer with male Eivor, and people were like, yeah, amazing, I want to play. It's the Viking fantasy I have with my long beard, blah, blah, blah. And then when we were like, oh yeah, but Eivor is the female name, she's going to be the canon character, blah, blah, blah. People got really pissed, and then they were like, well, then why isn't she in the trailer? And then Yubi was like, oh wait, we should do that. But then clearly just like put the female head on the male character's body. And then people were like super angry about this. But it also had this doubling effect when I talked to people about like, depending on who I would show the trailer to, if they'd only heard but not seen, if I showed them the female trailer, which I actually liked better because they didn't use some random song. They used like some of the score from the game, and I thought it was more epic. But it really seemed to affect people because I had a lot of people being like, well, that's not my Viking fantasy. I want the male, blah, 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 blah. So if I see the female-led trailer first, they were like, my automatic reaction is, I don't want to play that. So I'm wondering if you might consider putting the promotional aspect into this study or doing a companion.
That's a really good question. I had not thought of that so far, but that is really interesting. I mean, there were a lot of people on Reddit who said, I think of Vikings and I think of dudes with beards, so why is there a woman? And not in like an angry way, just like that. I mean, that is our cultural perception, right? Broadly speaking, dudes with beards. That would be very interesting. I think I could see that as like an add-on maybe later or something. Because I think that then though it gets more complicated because you have to consider where are you advertising and who do you expect to see it, right? And it's possible to track these things on the internet, but like even the fact that I'm presenting my survey to you guys, that is self-selecting already the people who are going to respond, and I've tried to get it out. I had a friend post it on Twitter, but it's all going to self-select a little bit. And I think that does play into our own preconceived ideas about what ancient societies were, right? Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. I'm going to have to think about that some more, how that could be done. That's a really interesting thought. Yeah. Thank you. That's interesting.
Yeah, happy to help brainstorm. I mean, I'm interested too. I'm not gonna lie, because I really thought that it was just striking that they build the world premiere of the trailer for the new game to premiere on like the IGN YouTube page. And so like I showed up with everyone else like in the queue, and I remember people were so excited. And then when it was like the same trailer, just different music and different face, there was like no buzz, nothing. They were just like, oh, I don't really want to do that. And then you can even see now, like if you look at the viewers under like both trailers, there's a huge discrepancy.
Yeah, there's some really interesting like with the promotional materials, like I'm thinking a lot about Odyssey, right? How much of it was Alexios, even stuff like the little figurines, right? Like a whole bunch of Alexios figurines before like the Cassandra ones were as popular. I was playing Odyssey the other day trying to get some last minute screenshots, and I realized her armor, it looks like a dude's chest. Like the way that it is made looks like and it just makes me wonder how I know that she was sort of probably supposed to be the main protagonist, but how much did they kind of just go, it looks the same, whatever, just put it on her too, and it makes her feel like an afterthought in some ways, which I think players can sense. I think they can sense, not necessarily in the main story where generally people say that she makes more sense, but I think we can tell like with the trailer, right? With the Valhalla trailer, it just doesn't, it feels right. It's like you slapped a face on, it's like the lip service thing, right? You said, look, we're diverse, we made a female. And that's not really how that's supposed to work.
Yeah, no, I generally agree. Although I will say the interesting thing is the difference between Eivor and Cassandra Alexios, though, is like people were pissed because Eivor was clearly wearing the exact same outfit. And you're like, of course it would look different on a female body versus male body. The interesting thing is the whole discourse with Odyssey, though, where people do say in all the different places, like you want to put the thick, heavy boxier armor on Alexios because he looks good in those like big broad breastplates. But Cassandra, like you would want to put her in the more slimming armor because she looks more feminine and better in those. So it's like they still kind of look same, but like it is interesting how there's still a segment of the discourse where it's like I wouldn't put her in any of the heavy armors because she just doesn't look good, and I wouldn't put Alexios in like the slimming armors because then you're like that just looks weird. I want them to have what fits their body type. So it's interesting.
Yeah, totally.
We got a lot of great commentary going on in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for that. I do want to invite anyone else who has any specific questions at this time to please approach the mic or put them in chat. We have just a few minutes here before we're going to be going to our next presentation.
I was trying to keep up with the chat, but did not manage to do so. But thank you all for your interest and your very interesting comments. I'm starting to read them now.
And your dances. And just
Okay, seeing nothing else, I'm just going to say thanks, Rose, for bringing your talk here. I was super excited.
My pleasure. Thanks everyone for attending. This is great. And thank you guys so much for organizing. I know this is a ton of work and I appreciate you all.
well, we're glad to have you. And as a preview for our next presenter, in just a few minutes here actually, we are going to have Samantha Supes, who will be joining us for the never-ending story of Gilgamesh, using Dungeons and Dragons to teach history and explore myth. So if any of you need to take a quick break right now, now is the best time to do so. And I will ask that Sam go ahead and meet me at the top of the room so we can make sure your tech is all set and ready to go.